to the same old man. Game over.
Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 605 for October 6, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this weekend, everybody. Very excited for this week's show as we are here to talk about the thing that everyone is talking about this weekend.
Angry
and
movie
that
fans.
Is Daniel Day-Lewis coming back and not telling anybody.
I was going to say, because I don't really want to talk about Discourse all that much. I feel like we have to. I'd rather just spend 3 hours talking about Daniel Day-Lewis.
I saw that and laughed so hard. It is incredibly appropriate that he came out of retirement and just didn't tell a soul. Like nobody knew about it.
That's such a Daniel Day-Lewis thing.
I just love that.
When the movie Phantom Thread came out, which was supposedly his retirement from acting, his final role, I think Jimmy Kimmel had Paul Thomas Anderson on as his guest, and they were talking about the movie, and obviously talking about how Daniel Day-Lewis has this, very method approach to performing. So I think Jimmy Kimmel asked Paul Thomas Anderson, him being Day-Lewis, him taking this break from acting, do you think this is all part of some type of other bit, like preparation for some other type of role? And PTA just said, now that's good. Now that's good.
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all because that's certainly who he is. And if memory serves, I believe this film that he's supposedly doing now is directed by his son, I believe is what.
Oh, that I did not
recorded
know.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that is the case. Now, I could be misremembering that, but, because I did see this a few days ago and, it was in the midst of my child screaming his head off and all that sort of daddy fun stuff. But
I have the Vanity
sure...
Fair. Yeah, I have the Vanity Fair article open right now where he is coming back from retirement to start in his son's film, Anemone.
Yeah.
I think that's how it's pronounced.
That's it.
Ronan Day-Lewis being the one who's directing it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That makes sense, right? Your son wants to do a movie. Let's go ahead and cast the greatest actor of his generation, if not of all time. It just also happens to be my father. And so it's like, okay.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure he did something like that before, too, where he starred in a 2005 film, The Ballad of Jack and Rose, that I believe was directed by his wife. So, so he's definitely done situations like this before.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly understandable. When it's a family affair and your son wants to do a movie, of course, you're going to jump at the chance to collaborate in that adventure. So it totally makes sense. But I do love that nobody knew about it. It just happened to come out. Someone got a photo. What's going on here? Oh, that's Daniel Day-Lewis.
Have we ever done an actor for a movie series before?
I don't think so. That would be a new one. I am pretty sure we've certainly done directors and studios, things of that nature,
and
but
certain franchises, certain things of that nature. You're right, but if there is ever one actor who is ripe for a movie series, it might be Daniel Day-Lewis because there's just not nearly as much to cover. And his career is so fascinating, and for the most part, he's a starring role in every movie that he's in.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's a lot to cover there. I mean, that is if we don't want to include one of his earlier works, like his brief appearance in Gandhi, which I think was one of his first ever cinematic appearances.
But his major performances, there's certainly enough to do a series there on. So I'm sure we can get into the actors realm as far as movie series go here in the near future. But either way, I laughed at that. It was easily my favorite piece of news to come out over the last week, simply because it's Daniel Day-Lewis. And just the fact that he just randomly appears and disappears. I love that about him.
What an interesting man. And yet he seems like one of the most sweetest and most sincere people in the acting sphere, if you want to call it that. Like the way he speaks, the way he articulates himself, he just seems very genuine. Normally I would equate this kind of behavior to someone being, a bit high on themselves, I guess. But like he definitely takes the craft seriously in a way that he clearly loves it, and I appreciate that. I would love to just sit down and talk with the man.
I agree, and I think what's also great about Daniel Day-Lewis is that he embodies at least what we call method acting. I know there's a lot of disparity as far as what the definition of that really means.
Yeah, that's
I know because Tom Hardy has pushed back against this in previous interviews.
Yeah.
However, as we understand it, as far as the audience interpretation of method acting goes, what I love about Daniel Day-Lewis is that he demonstrates that you can do it without being a complete prick about it. Because you get all these horror stories of others that do it, and it's a nightmare.
It's probably still really funny to be on set watching someone like a Daniel Day-Lewis never break character, but I've heard people say, such as PTA, that it's very helpful, that you don't really have much directing work to do. Because you're talking to the character. You're not even talking to Daniel very much. Yeah. So I can see how it could be helpful, especially if, like you're talking about there, DDL, he takes it seriously. He loves the craft. It's what drives him. And you can do that. You can stay in character, but be playful and respectful. You don't have to go all crazy and send people, pigs' heads or whatever, the horror stories are. I think the moral of this entire conversation is Daniel Day-Lewis is not Jared Leto.
Yeah, he's not Jared Leto. Yeah. So like, I love that about him. Yeah. It just feels like every story you hear about him as it relates to being in character, it's all done with reverence and playfulness and people just showing love for him. So
I told you about the story of this interview I heard with Josh Peck. He had a friend on There'll Be Blood, and of course he still has a trailer, Daniel Day-Lewis, and when he leaves set, he goes, "I'm going away now." I love that.
Yeah, he's the best. So I look forward to whatever this film is, assuming it gets some sort of wide release. I don't know. But I do love Daniel Day-Lewis. I do miss him. That is for sure. He's the best. On this episode, we are reluctantly, but it is very much out there, the discourse around cinema. We talked about this last week, but I think given what's taken place over the last week, we need to further talk about the current landscape of cinema, the conversations that are taking place, especially when you couple not just the Joker discourse or the overarching broader discourse that we brought up last week with Sean Fennessy's whole overarching thesis.
Yeah.
But then comes the news that the studios are creating these specific focus groups.
Yeah.
Which is all kinds of
nightmare fuel.
And yeah. So we're going to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We're going to delve into it. Hopefully you stick around because we need to be cathartic as far as how we feel about where this is all headed. But before we get to that, let's start things off as we always do. Is the parade on or off? And while the summer ended up after May, June, July, August, surprisingly, the parade was very much on. The box office was doing well. And then comes Megalopolis, which, as we talked about last week, is one of the biggest failures at the box office in recent memory, if not of all time.
It's up there.
Something that Francis Ford Coppola was aware of. It's not anything that we didn't see coming.
Right.
And then there's Joker too. And this is what's so fascinating about where things might be headed. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I know this summer did very well at the box office. I am curious if that does shift as we get into the fall season. Obviously, it's still up in the air. We don't really know. But Joker 2, which had a budget, I believe, of $200 million, if I'm not mistaken.
It was not low.
It was not low. of course, the first film made $1 billion, so they were going to throw a bunch of money at a sequel. We don't have, as we are recording this, we're recording this episode a little earlier than we typically do. So the full weekend box office numbers are not released as of this recording. However, it is projected that Joker Fully Due is going to fall somewhere in the 40 to 45 range, which is lower than what the initial estimates are. Yeah. It is one of Warner Brothers' lowest as far as quote unquote comic book movies go.
Sure.
And the cinema score is also the lowest for a quote unquote comic book movie as well. So fans of the first film are not liking this. Those that didn't like the first film are especially not liking this. It is showing up at the box office as well. This is on its way to also being a huge disappointment at the box office. Yeah. And I don't know if at the beginning of the year, any one of us saw this coming.
Yeah. You know, I think that's a good question, a good point as far as whether we saw this coming or not, because most of us, you and myself included, we would have guessed that Joker 2 was going to be pretty successful. Maybe not very successful, but at least pretty successful. You're right. Yeah. It's even tracking lower than its estimates right now. And given its budget, that's not a good sign. That's a pretty bleak sign for this opening weekend. There is an argument to be said that given the context of this movie, it is still an R-rated movie. It is still a pretty bold movie. So how many movies in its similar, I guess, R-rated vein would kill to have the opening that it still had? That's still another conversation that I guess you could have. But this
especially
is still
a musical, an R-rated musical having that kind of opening. Most other films would, to your point, would absolutely die for those kinds of numbers. Yeah. But in any other context, in this context, though, it's obviously not most of those.
But most of those movies are also not sequels to billion-dollar movies, nor are they comic book movies.
Yeah, exactly. With budgets of $200 million.
Yeah. So I bring this up to say maybe we should have dug a little bit deeper into, the discourse, the relationship to that first film. We may talk about that a little bit more during this conversation, because I think given what's going on with Joker 2, and especially with Megalopolis, I think these movies may end up being more exceptions than the rule as far as how box office results are going to look for the fall and winter season. I think these might be anomalies. I think Megalopolis is especially going to be an anomaly. That was always going to be a hard sell.
Yeah, we knew that. Yeah, for sure.
But maybe we underestimated the discourse around this specific franchise, the Joker franchise, or how it's connected to the Batman universe, how it led to such discourse back in 2019 when that first film came out, and how that was maybe going to trickle into this new one. Maybe that was something we just simply underestimated. But the numbers are not very good. They do look very bleak. The optimist in me is hoping and maybe even predicting that this won't be a trend for the rest of the year. I think these movies might be exceptions. And I say that too because we're talking about the parade in totality here. Parade is certainly not on for Joker 2. I mean, that's the point we're making here, right? But there were a few other positive things to take from the weekend. I don't know if you saw that on Twitter. It's not published yet because we are recording this a little bit early. The Wild Robot has surpassed over 100 million worldwide. That's at least a good sign. Yeah. So there are still some success stories here that could seem to suggest we are looking at two anomalies here, not the new rule here.
For sure. And I very much do agree. As we noted about Megalopolis, we knew that was coming. The Wild Robot being as successful as it is, that is very exciting. That is an original DreamWorks film. Not based on any previous film IP. It's obviously adapting a novel or book series.
it's a new experience, a new cinematic experience for audiences.
Exactly. So you never really know where those may land. To see that that's a big hit for DreamWorks is very exciting. And I noted that Joker at the beginning of the year, I don't think anyone would have anticipated it having these kinds of numbers. But I will say, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think many of us, once the trailers dropped and we started to see some of the marketing for Joker Fully Due, I don't think we're not too surprised. Like, I'm not.
I don't think it created the right kind of hype. Yeah,
I mean, given that it's an R-rated musical, and how that might mesh with those that liked the first film, I think that was always going to be a risk. I don't know if that was always going to reach the same target audience that really liked that first Joker. There's certainly going to be some crossover, but I do think the fundamental approach to the sequel was always going to alienate some of the demographic that liked that first film. And then you couple it with the marketing we did get, and honestly, there wasn't a lot of it. I do think that Warner Brothers in many ways struggled with how to market Joker Folie à Deux. And, I had this thought last week. I didn't really voice it on the show, but I did sit here and think, for a sequel to a film that came out a few years ago that made $1 billion, this film isn't making all that much noise.
Yeah, a film that also won its lead performance, Best Actor at the Oscars.
Yeah, it was huge. It was very, very successful. It reminded me a lot of the Lego Movie too, in the sense that the Lego Movie comes out in 2014. It's this huge success. I think it was even nominated for Best Animated Film that year. A lot of people loved it. It was in a ton of top 10s, top 20 lists of that year. People really went for the Lego Movie. It was a great surprise. The sequel comes out some years later. Nobody cared. Nobody talked about it.
It just kind of dropped.
Zero fanfare. Yeah. It was such a weird experience. I just kept sitting here thinking, how on earth was that first film so beloved? A sequel comes out and not a single person gave a damn. And it just kind of came and went like a fart in the wind. Like nobody even cared at all. And and that's what this reminds me of. It's like even Warner Brothers was like, this isn't really all that marketable. We'll put out a few trailers, a few billboards, a TV spot here and there, perhaps.
Yeah.
It all felt kind of lackluster. Like there was no energy to the marketing in any sort of way.
They probably didn't even know how to market it. And I'm also reminded of an interview that Morgan Freeman once gave talking about how and why The Shawshank Redemption was so unsuccessful. Yeah. Because most people were going to the movies thinking, what the heck is a Shawshank Redemption? So sometimes a bad title, or at least a confusing title, can really alienate initial audiences. And I do wonder if Folie à Deux is also part of that conversation, because there is a lot of confusion around that title, and I don't know if it's actually the kind of I don't know if it's creating intrigue as opposed to alienation, because that can sometimes happen, and I think that's obviously not the reason why the movie's not doing as well. I think the reasons we just talked about here, the more lackluster marketing efforts, really are the driving force here. But I do wonder if some of the bold ideas and the bold things that this film is doing outside of just the film itself are also par for that same course. And maybe it is. Like maybe there's a lot of other factors all compounding that are just really not working in the film's favor.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it is. Warner Brothers clearly didn't know how to market the film. The reviews come out, it's not very good. The early cinema scores come out, it's even worse.
It's at a D.
I mean, this is a film that is struggling to, as far as comic book movies. And this is where I do feel like the discourse kind of bleeds into what we're talking about here, because looking at these two films from Todd Phillips as comic book movies, I think is a little bit silly. There's clearly no intent from Todd Phillips or Joaquin Phoenix's perspective they're not making these movies as comic book movies.
No, that's not the point.
The first film was clearly a Martin Scorsese homage. The second film, and we'll have a review coming out this week, but it is deconstructing that first film. It is all about that first movie in so many ways, for better or worse. We'll certainly talk about that. But that is the approach to the sequel here. And yes, it has some musical homages to it and other classic movies, but those films are not trying to function like a conventional comic book movie, which in some ways is maybe what's so surprising about that first Joker film doing as well as it did financially speaking. I don't know if I would have expected it to make $1 billion because it's a far cry from the convention of as far as comic book movies go.
That's a good point because one thing we might not be thinking about here when we talk about Joker 2 and its quote-unquote surprising failure, should the conversation really be more framed as how surprising it was that that first film did as well as it did? Like maybe that's more like maybe that's more of the the anomaly than anything else, because it set maybe this expectation that was maybe not supposed to happen, and there was just other efforts that really led to that film's success that maybe were outside the actual film itself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that first Joker film, I know there was a lot of, I would consider disingenuous, but regardless, there was a lot of conversation around its violence. There certainly was a lot of conversation around its psychology. And that's what that film was about. It wasn't about Joker versus Batman or some sort of hero. It was a psychological character study. That's what it was. It just happened to be about a character that we all know well from the films and the comics, of course. He's iconic in the comic book world.
Absolutely.
And this second film has even less violence. There are really 2 outbursts of violence in that second film. Outside of that, it's a courtroom drama mostly. And again, a character study.
Yeah.
So it is not functioning as some sort of hero versus villain archetype. And the fact that that first film did so well, I do think is surprising. And so it's hard for me to classify those 2 films as quote unquote comic book movies when they're such a far cry. And I'm not talking about quality. We can debate that all day. I know a lot of people listening out there do not like those films at all. Do not conflate what I'm saying here. We can debate that all day. I'm not talking about quality. I'm just talking about fundamental approach. These 2 Joker films are not what I would consider to be a comic book movie. And so everyone's talking about how, as far as the comic book genre goes, it's got this D cinema score. It's doing worse than Morbius. It's doing worse than the Marvels, and like all these other movies that got terrible scores. And it's like, okay, I mean, I get what you're saying. It's also
not apples to apples.
Not
though.
applicable. It's not. I don't feel like it's quite the same. But I guess it does put into perspective to some degree how poorly received this sequel has been from not just critics. We've seen the critic scores, but also the audience scores are really, really bad.
Yeah.
And that is not going to give it any legs at the box office. So, it stumbles out of the gate, and it's only going to continue to spiral downwards.
Yeah.
So it's not going to have the kind of run it did last time, for sure. It's not going to have an Elemental type run. I mean, this film is going to fizzle out hard.
It's dead in the water. It's pretty dead in the water. Yeah, this will be one of those cases. I wouldn't be surprised in like 3 weeks they just decide to dump it on Max or something like that. Yeah,
and maybe, in all honesty, I think maybe that was the plan from the beginning of the year. Like, because there was another report that they didn't even test screen this film. Why they chose not to do that, I don't know.
That's so interesting.
I don't know if it's a contract thing with Todd Phillips and Joaquin Phoenix that they get final cut, that they don't want any input from the audience. I don't know if it was contractual. That could be part of it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Either way, no matter how you slice it, there's been no intent, at least comparatively to the first film. There's been the marketing push for this film has not been all that robust. And to me, it does feel as if A, they don't know how to market the film, and B, maybe the plan was, let's just do the bare minimum and get this thing on Max as soon as possible. That would absolutely not surprise me if that was the intent all along, given what we've seen, how this has unfolded.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either. It just feels like it feels like they didn't trust what they had. by the time it actually started getting made. It's one of those situations I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during whatever meetings they were talking about the film and what they're going to do with it. It really feels like one of those cases where you brought up the Lego Movie 2, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is a very similar comparison, which is a film that you and I didn't hate, but it's a film that felt kind of like half-assed in a way as far as how it was put together. It just didn't feel passionately made. And I'm not saying Joker 2 is in that same camp, but sometimes when you have a product like that just feels so lackadaisical, as you said earlier, I think that says a lot as far as how unsuccessful a movie can ultimately be. And I'm getting very similar vibes here. I think the other portion of this too, and this is maybe a moral to this entire story here, Todd Phillips should just never do sequels to his own movies.
I think that is absolutely true. Like I don't think he or Joaquin Phoenix gave too much of a damn. And it's certainly well, you know what? I take that back, at least on the Joaquin Phoenix front, because I do think there's an argument to be made he's actually better in this second film, in the sequel, than he is in his Oscar-winning performance of the first film.
Which is interesting, yeah.
I do think that he certainly gave it his all. I do think Joaquin Phoenix was invested.
Okay.
The film on the whole, though, the Todd Phillips of it all, to your point, I think there's very much an argument that he did it for the money, or again, whatever was there on the contract. But it doesn't seem to have the passion. There's no doubt about it. It seems so much less passionate.
Kind of like The Hangover Part 2, or even worse, The Hangover Part 3. They feel like obligations because that first one was so successful.
Well, and I think what's even funnier now that we bring this up, because there was a review on Letterboxd that was floating around. I don't know if you saw this or not. I'll see if I can pull it up so I can read it verbatim, because I thought it was really funny. This is from Anna V on Letterboxd. Her her review said, "This is like when that one mediocre kid somehow got 100% on a test, but everyone knew it was just because he copied the actual smart kid. But then the smart kid changed seats, so he then went on to get a 0.5% on the next test because he couldn't rip off anyone anymore. All to say, this is trash." And I think that kind of describes what this is, right? And again, for better or worse, we can talk about this. I love that review
so much. I love that review so much because I've seen Todd Phillips in interviews, and I've sometimes thought to myself, he reminds me of one of these kids I went to high school with that would absolutely cheat on tests. Like he just has that vibe.
The one thing that you can perhaps admire about Joker Folie à Deux is that it is not a Scorsese imitation. That element of it is gone. And again, we'll talk about it more when we get on the review, but I actually did appreciate that about Folie à Deux. The fact that it had its own identity, separate from Scorsese. Now, whether that works or not, to Anna's point, is a different argument. That doesn't mean it's successful. Maybe the test result is 0.5%.
Bad movies. I mean, that's a thing. That's a thing.
Yeah,
Ambitious failures.
Exactly. So he did move away from the smart kid, so to speak, and he did attempt to make that film, using a different identity.
Right.
And again, I do at least appreciate that, fundamentally speaking, but I think what hurts Phillips is that he didn't seem to have much of a conviction.
Yeah.
And I think as a result, that's why it does feel like when he's not copycatting one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, it feels like he's just failing the test. I don't, where I would push back against Anna's thesis, although it's very funny and I loved that review.
I love that review.
I love it so much as well. Where I might slightly push back, though, is I think Folie à Deux, again, I like the approach, I think could have worked if the conviction was there, I don't think he cared all that much though. And that's different.
And
it's one thing that the smart kid
It,
changed seats. And if Todd Phillips, even though he couldn't copy off the smart kid, in this case, again, under the analogy of Anna's review, I just don't think he cared. Like, it's not even that he was even trying to cheat on the second test. He just didn't care and just circled everything C because I just want to get done with this as fast as possible.
You can argue whether Megalopolis was a good or bad movie or not. In fact, it's a really messy movie that's not made all that well in totality, but conviction, that's the key word.
And that's
Coppola loved what he was doing with that movie, and you can sense that.
Exactly.
You can absolutely sense
that's Coppola, again, in this analogy. He's at least trying on the test.
Yeah.
I'm putting all of my effort into this. Yeah. I might get a C at the end, but goddamn, I'm putting everything into this.
Yeah.
And
he's going to get some questions exactly right and some way wrong.
He's going to zigzag. And to what we said in our reviews, maybe purposefully wrong, because I feel like the answer should be this, even though it's objectively not. Like that's a little bit of Coppola when it comes to Megalopolis. But I mean, Todd Phillips is just C. I'm done. Here's my test. Like, I just don't think he cared. And that's the difference.
I want to see him go back to making irreverent comedies like Road Trip or something like that, which I still think might be his best movie. I think Road Trip might, War Dogs is probably his best quote unquote movie. I'd say that's like War Dogs is probably his Pain and Gain in some ways by comparison to Michael Bay's own filmography. Like, I feel like that's the one that's at least trying to do something a bit more provocative and actually gets pretty close to something well said. I maybe that might be his best, but I would love to see him go back to some of that irreverence once again, because I actually think he does have a pretty good funny bone in his body.
Yeah, I did like War Dogs for the most part, and that was also a funny movie. Pain and Gain is a great comp because it's silly and goofy and weird, but it's all under the vein of it trying to be this sarcastic commentary. So I mean, I do like War Dogs, but I mean, he's not a director overall that inspires me all that much. Like, even that first Hangover, like, I don't love any of those movies. I think they're all fine comedies. They're fine.
I like the gimmick of the first one. I think it's fun, and I think the character banter is good. I think really the casting is what saves that movie more than anything else. And honestly, I would say the same about something like Due Date. I don't think it's a very good movie, but I actually do think Robert Downey Jr. and Zach Galifianakis have good chemistry in that one, even if it is a direct riff on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. It's basically the exact same movie. But I think when his movies are well cast, they are pretty effective as comedies.
I agree. So hopefully he moves away from this, because as we'll talk about maybe a little bit further and into our Joker review, the discourse around these films, it's so insufferable. I cannot wait for us to move on and to be done with all of this. And given the ending of Joker Folie à Deux, we are clearly moving away from this character and this specific world. And at least fingers crossed. I mean, I guess they could always bring in a different element in a different direction.
You never know.
Fingers crossed we move away from all of that. However, I'm ready to be done. As far as the box office goes, is there anything else you want to note before we move on?
Well, the only big thing I did want to note, maybe we could talk a little bit more about this, but I did allude to The Wild Robot hitting a pretty big milestone. And the fact that it has surpassed 100 million worldwide right now. And the movie, we talked about this last week when we talked about its initial success opening weekend. It was budgeted around, I think, 78 million. So for an animated movie like this, it was pretty modestly budgeted. And 2 weeks in, it's already surpassed that budget. Now, it's not at a point where it's profitable, but it's at a point where the trajectory is suggesting it's going to be a hit. It's going to be a hit. And that's, we love to see that for movies in general, but it's even better when it's a movie that's actually good. Like a movie that's really good. And we love when audiences can react that way to something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a nice transition into, I guess, my final thought on this before we move on. Because I'm looking forward here at the rest of October. And next week, speaking of the Lego movie, we have Piece by Piece.
Oh yeah,
Next
that's
weekend.
right. Yeah.
There's Saturday Night expanding more, and I'm curious how that fares at the box office. And then you get Terrifier 3. Now, Saturday Night and Terrifier 3 are counter programming, right? So
Very
that
much.
I don't think is going to hurt the Wild Robot at all. What I am curious about is how those two animated films fare against each other next week, because I don't know how much buzz there is for Piece by Piece.
Well, I mean, it's a documentary / biopic of sorts, just told in an animated / Lego lens. I mean, it's directed by Morgan Neville, who is known for his documentaries. He's one of the most well-regarded documentarians working today.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if obviously given the discourse around Joker 2, I don't think the success is going to be there even in its second weekend. I weirdly would not be surprised if number one at the box office next weekend is The Wild Robot.
That's my
would
point.
not be
like, I guess
surprised.
that's what I was trying to get at, because I don't know if Saturday Night or Terrifier 3. Terrifier 3 might do well. People, tend to really like those movies quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much impact it's going to have at the box office, broadly speaking. And maybe the snowball keeps going for The Wild Robot. Piece by Piece looks interesting, but it is a documentary. And, as much as I love Morgan Neville, I don't know where.
I think it's a hard sell. I think the concept is a hard sell.
Yeah. So, all of that to say, when I look at the box office for next week, I just don't know if The Wild Robot's going to be stopped. And I do love that. I do really like that a lot. So it's very possible that the trend keeps continuing. And then you get to the week after that. And again, it's Smile 2. It's Goodrich. Again, counter programming. The next 2 weeks are lining up very, very well for The Wild Robot to still keep building and keep those legs churning. And I'm very excited to see how far it can go, because once you get to the 25th, that's when Venom 2 or Venom the Last Dance, excuse me, that's when that comes out, and that's probably where it'll start to slow down a little bit. But
which is pretty incredible that it's 3 to 4 weeks where it's going to be carrying some legs. It's going to be running amok, and that's awesome. That's awesome.
Very, very exciting. Yeah. So I am curious what and I guess to a point I made earlier, as far as the fall and how that, again, from a broader point of view, how that translates to the box office, because if it is indeed true that The Wild Robot is going to win the next 2 weeks, and I don't want to completely discount something like Smile 2, especially with The Wild Robot being in its fourth week by that point.
I think Smile 2 could do well.
I think it could do well.
That first film has its fans. I think the one thing that could hurt Smile 2 is its length, because it's an over 2 hour movie, from what I understand, which is kind of surprising for something like that. But I will say, I'm not much of a trailer guy, and I thought that first Smile was pretty effective. I thought it was interesting. I think the marketing for Smile 2 is pretty awesome. That trailer is great. I love the concept and the gimmick of this, at least where it's taking place. It's almost like another trap of sorts.
Sure.
And I'm kind of intrigued by that. So maybe that's going to help sell the movie if people are having a similar reaction to the marketing as I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see a world where that does fairly well. So I am hoping, at least for box office sake and the health of the industry, that it does well.
Sure.
But, I could also see a world where the Wild Robot just continues to churn until we get to Venom the Last Dance. And that's likely going to be the big winner of the month for October. Is that film. So it does seem like it's going to be somewhat of a quiet month. I like, comparatively to the last few months, and obviously the summer films are the summer films. So it's not fair to compare October to July.
No, it's not.
I do think that, things will start to slow down for October. Then as we transition to November, and we get into award season, I'm going to be curious how that plays out. But yeah, I do think overall things will slow down a little bit.
Once November 22nd, I think, comes around, where we may have what people are trying to dub as this year's new Barbenheimer with Gladiator 2 and Wicked opening on the same day. Maybe that's where we have a success story if that ends up happening. But I don't know. If people try to manufacture another Barbenheimer, we know what happens. It's not going to work. So
well, they've tried to do that this weekend with Megalopolis and Joker. I don't know if you saw that or not, but
oh gosh,
Francis Ford Coppola on Instagram, I believe it was, because there was a tweet where someone was like, I'm excited. Like it was a meme as far as like the kids had their fun with Barbenheimer, but now the adults get to have their fun with Mega Jokerless or whatever his version of it was. And Francis Ford Coppola took that screenshot, posted it on his Instagram, and said, I prefer, what was his? Like Jokeropolis, I think is what his was.
Oh, I love his sense of humor. I really do. But like that pairing just makes no sense to me. Like what made Barbenheimer work so well was
that was two totally different
movies with two totally different audiences and different goals in mind, which is why like people trying to dub Gladiator 2 and Wicked as another Barbenheimer like thing, at least that pairing kind of makes sense. You know, like in a similar way to what Barbenheimer worked. Joker and Megalopolis. That's
unless
funny.
You want to go for the two ambitious films that are very messy and not really resonating with a large audience. Sure. Go for it. That would be an interesting double feature in that regard for sure. But
yeah.
At any rate, that is the box office. And as we transition to the fall, obviously we're going to have to reset expectations as far as whether the parade is on or off. The Wild Robot certainly keeping things on the track, and that is very exciting for sure.
That's good to see.
I want to bring this up. I know it wasn't initially on our list to talk about here, but given that everyone, you know what? Actually, I'm going to save it. I'm going to save it because
you're punting. You're punting.
I'm punting here because I think this might actually be a nice tie-in to our discourse conversation here in a minute.
Okay.
All right. So before we get to that, let's just quickly talk about the trailer for Juror number 2. So Clint Eastwood, his new film coming out here fairly soon. This is coming out. When is this coming out? November 1st. November 1st. And we get our first trailer this last week. So a month before it's released. Hey, film coming out.
Hey, Blitz almost did the same thing.
I know. I just find that hilarious. At any rate, so the trailer for Eastwood's new film comes out. And I must admit, maybe it's the Clint Eastwood of it all that, I was certainly aware of the film, but I didn't really have too much expectations. Certainly did not have much anticipation for the film. And then this trailer drops. And man, I was quite intrigued.
I was hooked.
Has the potential to be his best film in quite a while.
He's a really interesting filmmaker, Clint Eastwood is, and here he is cooking what looks to be a pretty thrilling thriller drama, kind of a fusion of the two in many ways. Here he is cooking at 94 years old. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible.
Absolutely ridiculous.
And you know what? It does. I've seen a lot of other people on Twitter react to the trailer in a similar way, so I can't take credit for this observation, but people noticing how much it feels so Eastwood with those like fluttering piano notes because he's probably going to compose the score himself, which he's actually a pretty good composer as well. That's something we don't talk about nearly enough when it comes to Clint Eastwood. But it has that kind of that it's hard to describe a Clint Eastwood film because they almost feel very like limited as far as their filmmaking tactics are concerned. But that's what makes his movies so visceral in a way. Especially his work in the early to late 2000s. That whole decade, he was on a string of successes. Even some of his grander films like Letters from Iwo Jima and Invictus still carried this this hazy small quality to them. And he's very good at that. And Juror number 2 seems to be tapping into that same ethos once again. So I'm very intrigued by this one.
Yeah, I am as well. Like I think the premise is really fascinating. It looks to be shot really well. The performances look great. The floating piano notes as you're talking about, that's classic Clint Eastwood.
Absolutely.
And I just simply couldn't help but think about the potential of what this film could be based off that trailer, at least within the filmography of Eastwood. I don't know if it's going to resonate as one of the best films of the year, but when I look at his recent output, Richard Jewell, I did like. I do think that's a pretty good movie. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's great, but I do really like it. I do think at the very least, this has the potential to be his best work since Sully, and maybe even his best work since Letters of Iwo Jima. Like, I think you could maybe go that far. Like, that's how much I thought about the potential of this film. Like, this could be his best film since 2006, potentially.
I hope so. And even some of his films that weren't the most successful from the 2010s onward, they still did some interesting things. Richard Jewell, I think, is a very good movie overall. The Mule is kind of interesting. I don't think it's great, but it's at least kind of an intriguing movie. 1517 to Paris is one of the most baffling failures I've ever seen, to the point that it's actually making me appreciate the movie a little bit more, just given the intent of it and what it's trying to do. But you're right. Like, this could be, I mean, maybe his best since Letters from Iwo Jima. I mean, I like Changeling quite a bit. I feel like I'm on an island on myself.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a Changeling defender. I between that movie and Gran Torino that came out the same year in 2008, I would absolutely take Changeling over Gran Torino. Not even close. And Invictus I actually kind of like too. I think that's a pretty uplifting sports historical drama.
Yeah.
That one I think is pretty good. It's really when you get to Hereafter onward that his films started to confuse me a little bit.
Okay.
At least that's the starting point for the most part for me.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't love Changeling nearly as much as you do. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I do agree with you about Invictus. I think it's fine. Like, again, I feel similar about that as I do Sully and Richard Jewell. Like, good movie. I can't say it's great, but certainly more than serviceable. Like, since 2008, I think easily his best film to this point has been Sully. And that's still not a film that I clamor for when you bring up the name Clint Eastwood. It doesn't immediately come to mind. But I think that is his best film. That or Richard Jewell. Like, I feel very similar about the both of them. So, yeah, I mean, since 2009, it's been quite the volatile experience for Clint Eastwood as a director. It hasn't been super great after that incredible run he had in the 2000s. So, yeah, I mean, maybe that's why the potential of this film just immediately hit me, and it just continued to waft over me because I thought it was a really well cut trailer. The drama looks fascinating. There is a version of this film that is psychologically and emotionally extremely nuanced. The way Eastwood directs his films, especially in recent years, the quick pacing of we're doing one take and moving on kind of thing. I don't think that has really worked out for him over the last decade. Obviously, if that was his format in the 2000s, it clearly worked for him there. But I do think if Eastwood really emphasizes that psychological teetering, it has the potential to be really, really great. And I'm curious to see how far he digs into that. I am a little hesitant, admittedly, because the last 10 years have proven that he hasn't been willing to dig that deep.
He deserves a new hit. Like, he does. And maybe this is the time for it.
But I think the potential's there. For Juror number 2, oh my gosh. It easily could be his best film.
And it is kind of turning over a new leaf in many ways. A lot of times artists, whether it be a filmmaker or a music artist or whatever, they tend to go through phases when the turn of a decade happens. And Richard Jewell closed out the 2010s, and that came out in 2019. Cry Macho was sort of like a swan song for him to showcase himself as also an actor. So that was maybe more of a meta film in many ways. But Juror number 2 seems to be a way of like turning over a new leaf once again. The same thing could be said about when he made Mystic River in the 2000s. That was almost like a new debut for him in some ways. It had it had a new vibe, a new aesthetic, and then he carried that vibe throughout much of his filmography afterwards. And like, it was almost like a rebirth in many ways. So maybe Juror number 2 is another new, fresh starting point, even though he's 94 years old. So who knows what this actually means? But
and I think that's it too. I think maybe that's why I want this to be a really great film, because as you've noted a couple of times now, he is 94 years old. It's very possible this is the last film we ever get from Eastwood.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be great if he goes out on such a high note? If that indeed is what happens.
Yeah.
Who's to say? I mean, there's not many 94-year-olds working at the level he is, so I don't know. Maybe he's just going to work forever. I mean, the man just continues to
somehow
keep
he's
going.
going to be making movies even after he's passed away.
Well,
maybe he's got like 5 movies already made that are going to be released posthumously.
Would that surprise any of us? No, of course it wouldn't.
Probably not. Yeah.
So we'll see. But if this is his last film, I'd love to see him go out on a high note, and I think it could. I think it could
too. I think it could too.
All right, Brendan, let's talk about coffee. It is my favorite on the planet.
We're recording this at a time when it's actually appropriate to have some coffee. We're recording during the day, and I had my good coffee called Sumatra this morning.
Gotta love that. Love a good Sumatra. It is a fantastic dark roast coffee with wonderful notes of chocolate in it. Sumatra is the best. I do really like that one a lot as well. Yeah. I had some cold brew this morning, some coffee called cold brew. That was my brew of choice. I have at least 2-3 cups of coffee throughout the day. It's how I get through with 2 young kids and screaming babies and all the fun joys of my life. And that's why we love Coffee Cult, because they source specialty grade coffee from all over the world, as Brendan just pointed out there, from Sumatra to Kenya to South America to all over the place, wherever they grow coffee. Coffee Cult likes to get it, and they get the best coffee. It is specialty grade coffee. We're talking high-end gourmet coffee. They take extra steps to make sure that it's not just specialty grade, but they're using every high-end bean they can. They're really thorough in making sure that it is the best coffee possible. So whether it's a single origin, a blend, whatever it may be, I mean, this is the best coffee. It's not going to be the cheapest coffee. It's not the Folgers you find at the store for $2 a can.
But what do they say? You get what you pay for.
You get what you pay for. But there is a big difference. If you want to do the taste test, I promise you, it'll shock you how different of a taste it is. You get a Folgers and even just get the Coffee Cult dark roast, let alone something exotic like the Costa Rica black honey, for example. You are going to taste something you've never tasted in your life before. It is incredible, the difference in quality. So go check them out. That's coffeecult.com, coffee with a K, cult with a K, coffeecult.com. Use our code ISF24. Again, that code is ISF24. You'll get 15% off at checkout. The fall is here. The weather is going to change. You're going to need your coffee. So stock up. Again, get that 15% off. And we thank Coffee Cult for their support.
Cheers.
All right, Brendan, let's talk about podcasting. And
we do it. We know it. We love it. And we have a great platform that helps us get episodes out all the time very smoothly.
Absolutely. That's what we love about Libsyn. You got to go check out Libsyn. They're a great podcasting service that can host your podcast. They currently host over 75,000 podcasts worldwide. They're a combination of liberated and syndication. And if you want to have a platform where not only you can host your podcast, but then you can get it everywhere, whether it be from Spotify to Apple, wherever. You got the RSS compliancy, you got the optimization, you got the stats and everything there. That's what makes Libsyn great. And I also have to shout out their support because it's really good. We recently had an issue where for whatever reason, our Apple Podcast subscription model was having an issue. Like I couldn't get a few of our bonus content episodes up through Apple Podcast subscription. And it took a while. I had to talk to them for what ended up being a couple of months, but we found a solution, and they were very helpful. They were very patient with me, and we ended up working through it, and
it's great
we
customer
finally
service.
got it fixed. So our bonus content feature on Apple is now available once again.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
it just speaks to how willing they are to help you through all of that. So,
Yep. And we've been using them since the inception of
Since the beginning.
InSession Film. And there's a
Yeah.
reason for that. There is absolutely a reason for that. And it's not even just the smoothness of their customer service and the efficiency of maintaining the show as long as we have because of their great hosting platform, but all the metrics we get from them that help the show grow, whether it be around social media engagement. You were just talking about Apple optimization from a bonus content standpoint. They are very helpful in providing resources to make sure that if you have a podcast that you want to start, it'll help you grow as well. You won't just remain static.
Exactly. They're very, very helpful in that regard. And that might be overwhelming if you're new or if you're not exactly sure how to start a podcast. But it is often rewarding. We certainly love it. As Brendan noted, we've been doing this for 11 years now. And Libsyn is here to make everything easy and convenient for you. They're absolutely fantastic. So go to Libsyn. That's Libsyn. Libsyn.com. Use our code ISF and you'll get 2 months of free podcasting when you do.
Yeah.
So again, that code is ISF, Libsyn.com, and you'll get 2 months of free podcasting when you use our code. So go check them out. That's Libsyn, Libsyn.com. And we thank Libsyn for their support. All right. As we transition into the current cinematic landscape, the discourse that we are currently living in at the moment, there are a few specific things we want to get to. Before we do, though, I want to start here with this mystery topic that Brendan and I didn't really go over, but I do think it tethers to what we're about to dig into as far as the discourse goes.
Okay.
And it relates to everyone's favorite topic, artificial intelligence. Because there was this fool on Twitter this last week that released a quote unquote trailer, and I use that term extremely loosely here, for Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke. This AI live action Princess Mononoke trailer. I don't know if you saw it or not, Brennan, because I admittedly couldn't stomach after the
I
first,
saw some images
3
of it,
shots.
but I saw some images of it. I saw some stills, but that was the extent of what I could actually stomach as well.
Well, if you want to, as we get into this, look at it on Twitter real quick. It shouldn't be hard to find.
I have some of it playing in the background. Let me mute it a little bit so that way I don't have to, have the noise. I don't want to block you, so I want to make sure we can still carry a conversation here.
Yeah, it is one of. I'll keep talking as you find that. But
I've got it playing in the background right now, so I'm just watching. Oh my gosh, what the hell is this?
It's so bad, dude. It's so bad.
It looks like a screensaver.
It's terrible. It's like, it blows my mind that a real person looked at that and said, yeah, this is great. I'm going to put this out there because this is the quote unquote future of Hollywood. And that's how he framed this. He framed this as being the future of Hollywood. This is the future of movies. Look at how cool this is. And I thought it was even funnier because he, in the thread,
eyes, the faces here. What kind of expressions are these?
It's so bad, dude. It's so bad. But in the thread, he even mentions that Hayao Miyazaki is anti-AI, but that he did this for himself. Like,
so what point is he trying to prove then? What point is he trying to prove then? Like is this a good thing or a bad? That's so confusing to me.
It absolutely blows my mind because he admits that the artist that made that film is anti-AI, but he did it anyway. So like, it's as if he's admitting defeat, but myopically and very selfishly is like, who cares? Like
it's almost like it's almost like he's trying to suggest that Miyazaki himself is wrong for thinking AI is. It almost sounds like an attack. Like, and I don't know if he's trying to frame it that way.
And that's it. Like he's trying to frame it as if he's coming from a place of reverence. Like, I love Princess Mononoke, and I know Miyazaki's anti-art, but I made this for me because this is the future. Like, that's how it comes across to me. Is like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, and he's very much not.
That's gross.
He's very much giving a middle finger to Miyazaki and those artists that made that film, which is all hand drawn, obviously.
I spent $745 in clean credits to show you a glimpse of the future of filmmaking. Well, I hope you don't make that $745 back.
I know, seriously, like it is.
It's reading the tweet
egregious. That footage is absolutely disturbing.
It's
it is
artificial.
So
it's gross. It looks gross. It looks horrible.
It does look really, really bad.
And what scares me too is when people are going to be making things like this, and if it catches on and gets enough people talking, both positively and negatively, studios might notice and get the wrong idea. Like the fact that people are doing this in general is also a problem. Whether it's trying to prove a point that it's good or bad, the fact that it can be done now is the scary thing. And that scary thing is also getting traction.
Well, and the ultimate reason that I bring this up, and that is a great springboard there, because I am not so much bringing this up so you and I can dunk on him as so many others have. It is really, really bad. But where I do find it interesting, again, is the discourse around it. Because on one hand, it does feel unifying to see so much of the film community look at this and go, this is terrible. This is one of the worst things, the most egregious things I've ever seen. On the other hand, though, what makes this a little nerve-wracking to me is that we have seen Hollywood in the last year or so really embrace AI and artificial intelligence. That's been such a big talking point. And I know like the writers and, there's been groups in Hollywood that have really pushed back against this, but it does seem as if the studios want AI. So as much as you and I hate this, other critics, our peers, cinephiles, I've even seen some directors comment on this and call it out as garbage as well. But we know the studio execs want this. So where is it? Like, if you and I, like if tomorrow, all of us collectively, if there was a report tomorrow that some studio executive, probably from Warner Brothers, was like, yeah, we saw this footage, we've greenlit this as a movie. It's going to be completely artificial intelligence. The whole thing.
Yeah.
Would we really be that surprised?
Probably not.
I don't think we would.
But the thing that wouldn't surprise me even more outside of that goes back to what I was saying. It's like the fact that this exists and it's getting so much vitriol from people like us, from filmmakers, from other critics, and even some general audiences that seem to think this looks terrible. The fact that there's even a loud dialogue around it might be enough for studios to want to push this even further. Because that negative dialogue could still stimulate people to see something like this out of sheer curiosity, right? In a way, I think something like this needs to just simply fade into obscurity. It sadly won't, but I think that's the best way to kill something like this is just to stop talking about it, or maybe a type of boycott or something like that.
I do think there is a danger if we simply ignore it.
No, I agree with that. It's more so to say that like sometimes you have to see something terrible out of sheer curiosity to see what it is. And I guess like the dialogue around it in general, I think is going to provoke a reaction that we're not going to want to see anyway. I think we're at a point that's just kind of nerve-wracking regardless of how it exists. I think that's the scariest thing for me is that we could scream to the heavens as loud as we want about how bad this looks. I think that would weirdly provoke studios to still do it even more quickly. Like I that's the thing that scares me the most.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is momentum in the AI community, and it's such a big part of business today, generally speaking, not just
it is
Hollywood, but broadly speaking.
And we should be clear, like from a general standpoint, we're not anti-AI, but we're anti-AI in the way that it's utilized in this kind of artistic way.
I'm very much anti-AI when it comes to art, for sure.
Yes. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to marketing, it is
there are AI tools that
useful.
work, that absolutely work, and that make jobs easier for certain people, but not every person.
Not every person. When it comes to art, there's absolutely no reason for it to ever be involved with anything.
I'm with you there. Yeah.
You have to let writers write. You got to let artists create, let directors direct, performers perform. Like
Absolutely.
You don't need to have artificial intelligence anywhere near art. But because Hollywood is a business and it is such a big proponent in the business community, I can absolutely see a world, probably the one we're living in, where studio executives who make these decisions see that and feel inspired, whereas the rest of us as the film community vomit over this. And that, I think, is going to create, it's already created outrage. There's been a lot of discourse on this already. God, and I think it's only going to continue. It's only going to continue because I do think executives are going to fight for this. I think they will. I mean, say what you will about how terrible that looks, and it is awful. But if you're
the facial expressions when they talk, it's hilarious.
It's so bad.
It's just so funny.
It's so bad. But here's the thing: like, if you're a studio executive and you do like this, and you read that this guy only spent $750 to make that, all of a sudden you're like, we can do this. Like, if we throw $1 million, all we need is $1 million, and we can take that footage and enhance it. I mean, it's going to scream cost effective.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely terrifying because now it feels like AI is just going to be infused heavily into whatever the project is on a budget with everything, with performers and everything else. You can make a large movie for $5 million because so much of it is AI. And, the thinking is you'll make 10 times that at the box office. Now, to your point, as far as curiosity goes, maybe that will invoke some people to go to the theaters, but maybe a boycott is in place. Because I tell you what, if they did do that, not necessarily Princess Mononoke, but
they did something like this,
a film and it's 60% artificial intelligence or 80% artificial. I mean, I don't know if I could go see that.
I don't think I could either. Yeah.
Like I don't think I could do it. Just out of like sheer purity and the love of art and film, I couldn't. There's no way I could stomach it.
The fact that this trailer exists, I feel so bad for Hayao Miyazaki right now.
I really do. It's a slap in the face. It is a slap in the face. This guy is doing nothing but leeching from one of the greatest filmmakers and one of the greatest films of all time.
Yeah.
To push his agenda as it relates to AI. It's absolutely disgusting. And look, the nice thing about this, especially as we veer into what we're about to get into next, is that at times it's wonderful to see the film community come together because so often we are polarized. There is so much vitriol that for us to come together for once was extremely refreshing. And every single one of us in one way or another was anti this bullshit. And that was cool to see. I mean, it was really fun to see that refreshing change of pace. So I think that ultimately that's why I wanted to bring it up is that one, the discourse will continue. I don't think this is going to be a topic that goes away.
I found this dude's Twitter and I'm reading some of the replies to him making this. It's pretty funny.
Well, I'm sure it is. I'm sure there's some really great tweets there.
Some of them are just very, I'm not going to read some of these things because I don't want to exercise the bleep button too much here.
Sure. Yeah.
But some of these are just very direct and hilarious. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, this is someone just writes ew.
Yeah, it's bad. Yeah, it's real bad. So yeah, I mean, it was great to see the film community galvanized for once. That was really what I wanted to, make a point of, because as we transition to the rest of this conversation, let's just say the conversation has been anti-galvanization because,
Yeah.
oh God. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I take it back. This next thing I'm about to get to, I think is very similar, but we've seen Discourse in recent weeks and months and days, as we noted earlier with Joker. However, another piece of news, and again, you read this, I'm about to read this statement. And when I do, even though it's not about artificial intelligence, but it is about marketing executives, studio executives, what I'm about to read, it's going to blow our minds in a similar fashion. So again, when I'm talking about those studio execs that would greenlit that AI movie, it's the same people that's doing this nonsense, right? Because this last week, it was reported that studio executives think that the best defense against toxic fans is to avoid provoking them in the first place. So, in addition to standard focus group testing, studios are going to assemble a specialized cluster of super fans to assess possible marketing materials for major franchises. Holy Lord, that is concerning. Again,
I have a lot of questions.
That's why you believe
I have a lot of questions.
That's why you believe the AI nonsense, right? And even as a hypothetical, you believe it because of this crap, because this is what studio executives are doing. And this is real world. This isn't even hypothetical. They are creating a world where the next Star Wars movie is going to be written by Reddit and Twitter, not by actual human beings.
That already happened.
Ridiculous.
That already happened. That was the Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
And look how that turned out.
Yeah. But now they're wanting to avoid. And here's the interesting thing about it. And interesting, I don't necessarily mean as a positive here.
No,
however, I think what's concerning here is it's a little bit twofold for me, in the sense that, one, they don't have much of a vision. And as a result, they don't have any sort of deep-seated, I don't know if reverence is the word, or again, maybe just go back to vision. They don't have any sort of plan in place. Because I think one way to avoid toxic fandom is to know the world that you're entering.
Yeah.
Whether it be Marvel, Star Wars. And while I think Star Wars is a different conversation, although I think some of this is Rian Johnson, not that he was ignorant to the world. That wasn't very much the case, as much as he was someone, as we talked about with Lucas and Phantom Menace, just kind of recontextualizing a lot of lore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, I think, a little bit different. But I think there is, something we've seen in recent years, as far as, especially when it comes to Marvel and DC.
Yeah.
Like they're clearly not aware of, like, I feel like given what they've made, knowing what they've made, there was going to be some sort of pushback, because they're not tapping into comic lore and what fans want and expect out of those things. Now, to some degree, I love that. I admire that. Like, I don't think you have to pander to what's on the panel because you're creating something completely different.
Yeah.
So I think maybe they could do a better job of bridging that gap of, we're going to create something new, but we want fans to love this, and we know this is what fans are wanting and expecting. And I don't think they've done a good job of that. I really think they've done a poor job of that.
And it's not that they haven't listened. They just haven't done the work themselves to find that middle ground.
Exactly. And I think that's it. And but on the same token, and this is, I think, what concerns me the most is that filmmakers, like whether you're making a Marvel movie, a Star Wars movie, whatever it is, if you have a vision for something, go make your vision.
Yeah.
And who cares what the fan what the fans want and think?
Or in this case, super fan. What the hell defines a super fan by their definition?
I don't know.
I mean, that is a legit term. And I've used that when it comes to our marketing efforts for my band and for music purposes. But that's something you can actually track. If you let's say you're a band that plays a lot in a local area and you have the same 5 or 6 fans that come to every one of your shows, that's something you can track. There's a metric there. Maybe they're always the ones listening to your music or sharing your music. There is actual metrics there. How do you define a super fan when it comes to this kind of medium here? I'm sure there are metrics, but that's just I don't get that.
I mean, I don't know if studios are able to keep track of, let's say, box office receipts per person. I mean, everything's if it's on the app, then absolutely. At least the theaters can, right? Like if I'm
Theaters
buying,
can, yeah.
If
they have that kind of, if they have access to that data, then
which
maybe
I'm sure they do, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they're selling to the studios. That 100% is happening. And then you can also look at social media posts. So if you have, Superman fan 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here on Twitter, and all he posts about is Warner, or not Warner Brothers, but like DC and Superman and the Batman movies, if that's all he's talking about, and you can objectively count that on his social media posts, then there's those metrics as well. I don't know if Warner Brothers is doing that.
Yeah, I'm curious
know.
what they define as a super fan, but if that is the case, if those are the metrics that they're going to use that you're talking about, aren't these the worst people to have involved in these conversations?
Well, and that circles back to the discourse of it all, right?
Because they're usually the loudest person in the room.
The loudest people in the room when it comes to Star Wars and Marvel and DC, these, how we would label them as super fans, have been the most abusive.
They've been the most toxic.
The most toxic.
Yeah.
Why are we listening and pandering to them? That's where this becomes somewhat akin to AI in the sense that it is anti-filmmaking, right? When you make a movie that is all AI, that's not filmmaking. That's just artificial intelligence mimicking something that already exists from a previous artist creating actual art. This is not too dissimilar in that it's not filmmaking. You're listening to fans to regurgitate something that already exists and like on the page and in a comic form. Why do we have to create the same things over and over again just to pander to the loudest people in the room?
Yeah.
But that's exactly what they're doing here. And this is where the discourse, unlike the AI of it all, the discourse here is much more vitriolistic in nature and much more volatile. And I don't know, man.
I'm scared. And I'm even more worried because you posted this on our Facebook group chat where we have a lot of other people interacting. And it seemed like for the most part, maybe 80% of the comments from what you shared were all in agreement with us. But there were a few people who thought this sounded like a good thing. And the way that they seem to describe this as a quote unquote good thing, saying, hey, like the fans should be involved. They should be listening and they should be offering feedback. That's what studios are already doing. It's called test screenings. It's like all this stuff exists. That's not the same thing as what they're talking about here. It's a very different thing. So this is where it goes back to us talking about how the studios themselves are they're not doing the work. It's their job to do the right work. And this is not the way to do it. This is going like I can imagine them trying to do this once and it turning into the biggest shit show in just one effort. And maybe that's what they need to do. Maybe they need to try to do this quote unquote super fan focus group for one movie and to see how poorly it goes, because I think it's going to go very poorly, and then they just never do it again.
That's what we can hope for. Yeah.
Maybe that could be the light at the end of the tunnel here.
I completely agree. I think if you're a major studio, though, if you're hiring a filmmaker to come in to create a project, hopefully you're doing that on the basis that this
you're trusting
person,
this filmmaker.
you can trust the craft that is about to take place.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps it depends on context and what you're trying to accomplish. Because sometimes that can go poorly. We just talked about that with Joker, Folie à Deux. Clearly, Todd Phillips didn't care.
Yeah.
I don't know what those conversations were like behind the scenes. I assume that Todd Phillips, when they said, hey, we want to do a sequel, and he's like, this is what I'm going to do. Like, at a certain point, they had to greenlight that movie.
Yeah.
Especially when you're throwing $200 million at it.
Yeah. They had to agree on what he wanted to do.
Yeah, and look, they let him make the movie that he was going to make, for better or worse. Clearly, in this case, for worse. Whereas we've seen the other end of that coin so much with Marvel in recent years, where they're hiring these low cost indie directors to come in so that way they can essentially be puppets for their larger MCU world building. And they don't want necessarily the vision to be too auteur-ish. At times you can feel the thumbprint of those filmmakers, but on the whole, they're more concerned with the larger MCU and where that's going to go. And they don't want a Todd Phillips coming in and creating his own thing separate that completely disrupts that momentum.
Yeah.
And that's also concerning. And if you throw this whole superfan nonsense into that mix as well,
the number of filmmakers who are going to turn down projects just given that added bonus of super fan focus groups now, it's going to be insane, because
you
now
don't even need a director. Like at this point,
don't.
Marvel especially is such a machine that you can just throw anyone in there. I know Feige can't do it he can't be in all these places at once, but you can throw in a random producer at this point to just say, this is what we want out of this shot. This is what we need out of these scenes. So much of it is digitized anyway.
Kevin Feige he could absolutely direct a Marvel movie now. And I don't mean that as a compliment. Like I don't mean that as the same thing.
Well, I mean, because they're shooting so many of these things simultaneously, he can't physically be there for all of them, which is why I go back to like just a group of producers that he trusts. Like, you don't need a true director anymore, because all of this is puppeteering anyway. So like him and his group of producers who are producing all of these movies, just get someone in there to go, this is the shot we need. It's all going to be digitized anyway. And with these super fan focus groups, this is what we want out of them. Just, take that feedback and go create those moments.
Yeah.
You don't really need an art. You definitely don't need an artist, but you don't even need a director for that. Not one that has a vision and is trying to accomplish something.
And no director is going to want to do that. They don't want to be pigeonholed that much. Yeah.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, yeah, exactly. And no director wants that anyway. So why even bother with a director?
Yeah.
Like, why even bother? You don't even
because
need
on
them
one hand, their vision is completely limited already, but at the same time, then it's like this added danger that, these are what the super fans want. Now you can't even piss them off, and if you do, you're going to get in trouble. Like, that's a risk that no filmmaker is going to want to take now, especially given the way that the discourse is.
Yeah,
as the years go on, now that we're almost 10 years removed from The Force Awakens. And then, with The Last Jedi after that, which really was kind of the starting point of a lot of this discourse being as noticeable as it was, I have a lot more respect for Rian Johnson just as a person for not letting it get to him. I really respect him as a filmmaker, as a person now, just given what he had to go through, what his film had to go through. And he's still out there churning Netflix hits with this Benoit Blanc series that he's doing. I respect that out of him.
He's out there creating films that I very much do like and admire as well. I do wonder if you were able to have an honest, like a true honest conversation with him, how much of that does affect him. Because after all, he is a human being. I just can't fathom that it didn't affect him at all. I'm sure it did to some degree.
I'm sure it did too. Yeah, I guess like
I'd be curious.
The bravery of how he's not hiding, from
I agree.
He's not under a hole hiding from all this and then waiting to make movies when it dies over.
I agree. Wholeheartedly agree. I love that he's out there. He's still making movies. He's doing his thing, and we all love him for it. And to that same reverence, the approach to that Star Wars movie over the years is, I think it's quintessential to this conversation, right? Because that film would not exist as it is if it came down to a cluster of super fans dictating what that film is going to be like. Because there's absolutely no way they would have allowed him to create Luke the way that he does in that film. Absolutely, right? That is the nucleus of that discourse. However, and while I don't love it in execution per se, I love the bold risk he takes in that film.
I love the idea.
I love the choices that he makes. Absolutely admire. And it takes an artist. It takes a filmmaker to do that, not a cluster of super fans. And if it comes down to super fans, you don't get choices like that. Yeah. But that's what makes that film so fascinating.
I want to ask you something on, and I know we might be getting a little bit off topic here because this is a very Star Wars specific question about maybe how the discourse got as rampant as it did. Because you referenced not the Force Awakens, but the Phantom Menace when it came out in 1999, which if you were alive at that time, the discourse for those prequel films were not great. They were not great. But they're being looked upon more favorably now, especially given the landscape of Star Wars nowadays. But I do wonder, the Phantom Menace, when that came out, that really started a whole new trend of deconstruction with regard to Star Wars. That started something new.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if the discourse nowadays would be as loud if, let's say, the daring swings that The Last Jedi takes was actually the starting point of this new trilogy. And I think they are there in The Force Awakens. I agree with you. I think that movie is very much a subversion in many ways. But a lot of people didn't pick up on that subversion very clearly. There was still a lot of people who felt, oh, this is clearly a Star Wars movie that's just inspired by Star Wars, which I think is kind of the wrong message. But do you think maybe that unfortunate and maybe even incorrect reaction is why The Last Jedi was so heavily criticized by that same demographic? Because they really felt that same polarity between two films that just came out back to back.
Yeah, I think that absolutely plays into it, because if people were more talkative about the subversions of The Force Awakens, I do think the expectations perhaps for The Last Jedi would have been quite different, and maybe people would have been more prepared for what Rian Johnson was going to bring.
Yeah.
Part of it is I don't think the larger audience was aware of Rian Johnson and who he is as a filmmaker, because if you do, what he brings to that film really isn't much of a surprise if you know Rian Johnson.
It's a Rian Johnson movie. Like they gave this huge budget to this guy to do whatever he wanted to one of the most respected and fan heavy franchises of all time.
Yeah, and it's wild. It's absolutely wild. However, I don't necessarily blame the larger audience, the larger Star Wars audience, for not knowing who Rian Johnson is, but I do think that also would have helped. Yeah. But I think you make a great point that no one really talked about The Force Awakens, and even to this day, I still don't think it's talked about enough how subversive that film really is. Yeah. And it's a film that is extremely aware of the mythos of Star Wars and what makes that world tick. And JJ did such a phenomenal job of reversing the roles that we had come to know of. And I think if that was talked about more, then going into The Last Jedi, there would have been an expectation of, okay, this trilogy or this series of films is clearly toying with the lore of Star Wars. You know, I need to expect that coming in. Perhaps that would have changed things. Now, I say that to say I still don't know how much it would have helped in the long run, because it's one thing
that's true
to talk about Darth Vader and Kylo Ren and the reversals that we saw in The Force Awakens and everything that makes that film great.
Yeah.
We're talking about Luke Skywalker, one of the most iconic heroes of all time. and you're completely subverting everything we know about that guy. And again, this circles back to a conversation we've had a million times, because that's where the execution part of it does falter for me. I love the idea. I'm so glad that Rian Johnson made the choice he did. And again, it takes an artist to do that, not a freaking stupid focus group. It takes an artist that has the balls to make the choices he did. For me, it just comes down to execution, because like so many other of these fans have pointed out, the last time we saw Luke is that he wasn't afraid to confront the dark side, and it was his optimism and his hope and his leanings of life that's what saves his father. Like, his love for his father is what saves him in the end. But that's not the guy we meet in The Last Jedi.
Yeah,
like, that guy is gone.
The context is not really there.
There's something that happened that the film doesn't fully articulate to make sense of that change. Yeah. So that, to me, is my issue with it. But I love that choice. I love the idea, but I can see why fans are confused by it because of so like and I think because he went after Luke. After Luke specifically, that's what Rian Johnson went after. I think that's kind of where things fall apart. And I don't know if the conversation around The Force Awakens would have fixed that specifically.
Well, you're right about the execution. And I do think there are things in Mark Hamill's performance in The Last Jedi that maybe add at least some of that context, but not fully. So if you don't quite grasp onto the performative angle of it, then there is definitely a problem there. But if I have any nitpicks with The Last Jedi, especially as a film, it's the way that Rian Johnson seems to be prioritizing the boldness itself as opposed to how it serves the story. There's a scene. There's a scene in that movie that I still don't like at all, and it's the revelation where Rey finds out how Kylo Ren was kind of quote unquote birthed, right? Yeah. And the way she confronts Luke about it, like, did you create Kylo Ren? And the way that Mark Hamill looks at her, it's almost as if in the theater, I literally thought he was going to stand up, twirl his mustache, and put on a Darth Vader helmet himself. And it's all about the execution. Like, Rian Johnson is clearly playing with that expectation. And I think the way he plays with that expectation is perhaps the thing that soured fans more than anything else. Yeah. And I've talked to a lot of my friends who are big Star Wars fans that aren't film critics at all, and they hate The Last Jedi. And the way I talk to them about The Last Jedi, they actually agree with that sentiment. They don't dislike the direction of Luke as a direction. They hate the way it's played in the movie, because they felt like they were just being poked. Like, they were just constantly being poked the whole time. And I kind of sympathize with that, because I do think Johnson is doing a little bit of that, maybe too much, even if the Star Wars franchise maybe needed a little bit of that at that point. So, like, I don't. There's two sides that can be right in a way.
I agree. Like, I do empathize with fans because, again, I do think the execution is a bit off, and that because of that is going to create a vagueness that leads to people feeling frustrated. Yeah. Even with all of the bold choices that he makes, if he brought more clarity as to why Luke changed from where we last saw him to where he is now. And I mean, again, I love the humanity of it, but like, there's got to be some sort of context because people just don't change, randomly like that. There's going to be something to provoke that. The film does bring up an event that does cause it, but I don't know if it's enough in execution to really make sense of it, especially given the context of Kylo Ren and the subversion of him in the previous movie, which again, I think is also fascinating on its own. So it just doesn't make like, there's just not logic there and clarity. I don't know if that was something that was brought up in test screenings. If I was a part of that test screening, that's what I would have told Ryan. I love this idea. Love it. I just think it needs some more clarity. And I think because there isn't any clarity, it just rubbed people the wrong way, and then it led to what happened.
Yeah, so, they probably just felt turned Luke Skywalker, my beloved hero, into a bad guy.
Yeah.
Like that's how they probably read it.
But a super fan focus group is going to tell Rian Johnson to F off. Get out of here. We don't want any of this.
We don't want you making this movie.
Yeah. We want our hero back. That's what they're going to tell him.
Yeah.
And and that's where I agree with the Last Jedi defenders.
Yeah.
I don't want to see the same Luke Skywalker again. I don't necessarily need that. I love the idea.
I want the intent of The Last Jedi. I maybe just want it in a slightly better movie.
Exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I should also say, I do really like The Last Jedi as a movie as well. I think it's beautifully made. I think it's actually one of the best Star Wars movies in general. But we have to emphasize maybe some of its filmmaking and storytelling blemishes that perhaps are the inadvertent reason that's causing more of this discourse as opposed to just the what of it all. Because you're right, execution does absolutely matter.
It does matter. And that's where I get concerned about where this is going to go forward, because I want those bold storytelling choices.
Yeah, me too.
I think about something like The Lord of the Rings, and because I'm currently reading the books right now.
Yeah.
And I think as far as an adaptation goes, I think it's quite impeccable, because I love the films with all my soul. I'm admittedly struggling to get through these books because I don't love Tolkien's writing at times. It's so meandering.
The Hobbit is so much better. Yeah, that's where he succeeds, where I think some aspects of the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a novel, or a set of novels, really, it don't always work.
I mean, because it's Lord of the Rings, there's still plenty to enjoy, but I do think the writing is a bit overdone for sure. And that's where, as far as an adaptation goes, I'm like, man, he nailed it. Peter Jackson absolutely nailed it. But I guess on that same token, for fans that love the books, especially more than me, I could see a world where they look at the adaptation of Peter Jackson and go, well, why didn't you include this? Or there's this element or this piece of lore that you need to include. Like, if it came down to super fans, those movies wouldn't exist as they are, I would imagine. I can't fathom that. It's hard for me to fathom that.
I have a few friends, and I may have told some of these stories before on the podcast, but if we have any new listeners, I do want to reference this. I do have a few friends. I won't say their names or even how I know them, but I'll just say they're big Harry Potter fans. They're big Harry Potter book
that's another one. Yeah,
they're very big Harry Potter book fans specifically. And I have one friend in particular who has said, The Prisoner of Azkaban, the movie, is absolutely horrible. And I say, why? And this person says, quote, they don't wear their robes outside. Screw this movie. I'm not even kidding. I am not even kidding.
Yeah.
But let's see, like, is this the definition of a super fan? This gets back into another conversation we've had a lot, and it's about the art of adaptation. And the art of adaptation is all about a new visionary coming in and doing his or her own thing with something that already exists. The idea that an adaptation of, let's say, a book, a television show, video game, whatever it is, into a movie, a good adaptation is not the same thing as that counterpoint. It's not redoing the exact same thing.
It's not a complete regurgitation.
There's a difference between adaptation and regurgitation. That's a great word to put it. And I think so many super fans out there sadly conflate the two. I think they see good adaptation as the same thing as regurgitation.
That's a really great point. And that's what the Star Wars fan was, a regurgitation of Luke Skywalker. They wanted their hero back.
Yeah.
And Rian Johnson wasn't willing to give them that. And
he was not interested in that.
I love that. Absolutely love that. And, same thing with Harry Potter. Like, Azkaban, the book, is so different from the film, and yet both of them are great on their own terms.
They're both arguably the best of their respective series, right?
I agree.
It's arguably the best movie and the best book of those of that series.
Yeah, the first time I went through the book last summer, not this year, but the year before, I was really taken aback about how different Azkaban, the book, is. And I loved it. It's my favorite book of the series, and it is so different from the movie. But like, they're both really great. I kind of feel the same way about Order of the Phoenix as well, because in the book, Harry is, for the lack of a better term, he's an asshole. Like, he is a dick through a lot of that book, And I love that in the book that they do remove from the movie. They make it, like he's still angry in the movie, but it's done with more.
But that same
tender
dickishness, if you want to call it that, like that wouldn't work for that particular movie.
I agree.
So,
I agree.
Fans become an issue because they might say, no, I want my Harry to still be a jerk. But then all of a sudden it fails the movie given what the movie was intending to do because it's a complete contradiction tonally.
Exactly. And I love that. I love how different that is. And I don't need super fans of the books to I wouldn't change much about those movies Azkaban on. I think well, I guess
there might be some plotty things. Like I will say, if there's one thing from the book Azkaban, Prisoner of Azkaban specifically, that I think should have been included in its movie counterpart, it was maybe more emphasis and I guess explanation as to who Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs are, the creators of the Marauders map.
That's fair.
But it's more of a narrative thing to just lessen confusion as opposed to just wanting to see that there. But that's probably the one thing that I maybe would have said, okay, as a fan myself, if I were part of any of these focus groups, I would say maybe at least have a quick little dialogue between Harry and Professor Lupin that maybe just went a little bit into that. And that's it.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I think that's very fair. Again, I think maybe on a similar token, there's more you could do with Snape and his connection to the what's it called? The prophecy is the word.
Oh, the prophecy. Yeah. Okay. I got you. Yeah.
So
I was wondering where you're going with that.
Because there's a connection there that the films doesn't really care to get into. That does, because the whole prophecy element of the films is lacking clarity for sure. Yeah. That makes much more sense in the books. So yeah, I mean, super fans might be able to help you with certain things like that, but I think on the whole, they're gonna cling to things that I think aren't necessary for the adaptation element. And I think in terms of the give and take, we're gonna get way too much of them influencing the films in ways that are not necessary or not helpful.
Right.
But again, I think that's just where normal test screenings can fix some of those things. Like you bring in this element, I'm kind of confused on it. And maybe, again, specifically to Harry Potter, they probably didn't care about the prophecy because these films are already 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And we got to cut something somewhere and let's focus on the characters and their emotions. And that's ultimately where those films lean. And I love them for that.
Yeah.
But sure, like there's like one of my favorite things about Deathly Hallows, I guess the Battle of Hogwarts. Like there's so much kind of leading to Fred's death that is just out of the movie. But in the book, as I'm going through it, I am a mess. It is so good. Like all of that in the book is great. Did I need that to be in the movie? Not necessarily. Like I think the way that film is done, I think is fine. I still think it's a good movie. I much prefer part 1 to part 2, but I still think it's good.
Well, I
don't know if we needed all that.
Well, I will say, and this is not to say one does it better than the other, but I do like how Deathly Hallows Part 2 as a movie treats death and destruction in its own way. That's not the book. The book does kind of lead into and kind of prepare you for someone who has just passed away, whereas in the movie it's kind of sudden. Like if you're not paying too close attention, you see that one of the Weasley twins has passed, but you don't really know right away who it is, and yet weirdly that does add kind of a devastation to it. Like this kind of bittersweet quality, this sting where and I think that's what serves the movie, whereas the way it's done in the book may not have served that particular movie as much. That's where the art of adaptation is clever and done well to separate itself.
Yeah, I agree. Especially because the movies wanted to be, from Harry's perspective, obviously they had to condense things. And there is something about Harry just walking into that corridor and seeing all the bodies there, including Fred, and letting that waft over him.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it is very poignant. I agree. So that's where I don't need it to completely regurgitate the book.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely a world where a super fan is going to complain heavily about those kinds of things. And
absolutely,
what do the studios do in response to that? I don't see where this is going to thrive at all. It's not going to be good. It's not going to be good.
I worry. I absolutely worry because, like we said, they're the loudest people in the room, and they're just going to want their regurgitations.
Yeah, and I like, because we live in a world that is so loud thanks to social media, you're just not going to please everybody anyway.
Yeah,
like I think the studios need to just embrace the idea that this is going to happen regardless. But you got to let these filmmakers just make these films. You got to let them take these choices. Like let them adapt the material. Like if you can think through that all and be like, hey, I could see fans not liking this because this is how it is in the comics or in the book or whatever.
Yeah.
Like those conversations happen all the time anyway.
Absolutely.
So like, I just feel like we're heading toward disaster, and it's going to be nothing but pandering. Like the whole films will be nothing but pandering.
Yeah.
And I don't know how this ends well.
I mean, like I jokingly said earlier, we've seen a movie already that did this, that tapped into what the quote unquote super fans wanted, because the Rise of Skywalker episode 9 feels very much like a quote unquote adaptation of a bunch of Reddit pages. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I will say, like, the reports that came out did not name specific studios. At least I don't think I've seen any one of them named.
I didn't see either. Yeah, I feel like they're keeping that pretty close to the chest at this point.
It could be all of them. It could be all of the major studios that are doing this. However, does this not feel like it is led by Disney, though?
I mean, it does. It very much
does feel like it's led by Disney, especially because of, I think of a couple of things. It's absolutely the Rise of Skywalker and that disaster. And it's been some of the Marvel stuff in recent years. So I think of the She-Hulk debacle, which I liked She-Hulk. I thought the show was a lot of fun, but the conversation over that was absolutely
I thought the conversation was
insane.
exhausting. I didn't love the show, but it's one of those cases, once again, where it's kind of like with The Acolyte for me. My reservations for those shows had nothing to do with the discourse. I just didn't think they were very good shows for other reasons.
Yeah, Star Wars is certainly a big part of it. Yeah, it's The Acolyte. It's not just the Rise of Skywalker. It's a lot of the Mandoverse. There's been that as well. But certainly the Marvel stuff in recent years as well.
Yeah.
And it's the other element of this conversation we haven't really got into that is a big part of this as well. And you and I really aren't the biggest. We shouldn't be leading this conversation, but I think we should at least bring it up because it is a big part of it. Because a lot of the toxicity that comes out of the conversations over these franchises relates to women and people of color.
Yeah,
it's not an accident that those that are the loudest in the room are going after projects and performances that include women and people of color.
Yeah.
Again, you and I can't dissect that as well as others can, but I at least want to bring that up. Like, that's a big part of this as well. Like, how do the studios respond when it's rooted in those kind of horrible behaviors?
Yeah, and how they take the wrong message from that.
Yeah, and how they take the wrong message from it. And that's what's really disappointing here, right? Is that they're creating these super fans who are going to recast roles or rewrite roles that would have been for a person of color or for a woman or whatever the case may be, because they want it to be status quo. And what has that been? Well, it's been men in these roles. It's been white. And that's the way we want it to be. And
God forbid they do a superfan focus group if they tried to do that for James Bond.
Okay. Yeah, good luck changing the character then. Good luck.
Yeah,
That's never going to happen.
Which I don't know if is the best example. I'm not sure if that's a property I necessarily need that type of push for. I'd rather see a new franchise, a new thing take time to build that actually can focus on that. But I mean, God forbid the vitriol and the super fan focus group that gets put in place if that franchise and Barbara Broccoli and her team were to attempt that.
Yeah. I live in Florida, so this is going to happen a lot to me, simply because of where I live. But I was with a group of people last week even, and I don't even recall how this was brought up. I think we were just talking about movies in general, and this kind of issue was brought up. And I didn't bring this to the table, but some of the individuals there, they were talking about The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid has to be white and has to have red hair. Like that's what they were saying. Has to be white, has to have red hair. As if those things are defining to the character. And they're not. They're simply not. And, like there are specific characters from various stories where the character being a person of color is fundamental to the character. And changing that is extremely disingenuous.
Right.
At best. The Little Mermaid, her skin color doesn't really influence that story at all. And so like the idea for Disney to change the character for the live action version, I think fundamentally that's a perfectly fine idea. Like there's no reason for outrage there. The only reason it'd be your nostalgia or your values being hurt because it's not what it was in the animated version. As well, again, it has to regurgitate the same thing.
I was just going to say regurgitation versus adaptation. Once again, that analogy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like that. I think that's a big part of this as well. Yeah. I at least wanted to acknowledge it.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Just to round out all of this. But yeah. The superfan stuff,
scary thought. Scary thought. That sounds like a league of super villains about to form.
Yeah. Anything else you want to bring up before we wind down?
No, that was kind of depressing. Let's talk about good things, or at least we can try to. Let's go back to talking about the Wild Robot passing $100 million. Let's talk about Beetlejuice now hitting $400 million worldwide.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. So there are good things. There are good things to talk about. This is not one of them.
Yeah. This isn't one of them, and it is interesting how movie Discourse, like. Now, after going through Sean's sentiments last week on the show and reflecting on them more, and I look at how things have been over the last 2 weeks, and I very much see what Sean is talking about in a deeper, more almost profound way. Yeah. Because there's, what the pushback against, the AI and the studios here, that feels a little bit more, I don't know what the word is. Like the vitriol, like there's a clear definition between, these super fans and then us in the film community who clearly pretty uniformly do not want these things.
Right.
Where I think the discourse, and I know we're going long here, but I think where the discourse is perhaps a little bit more gray. And again, sorry to, I guess, undercut your sentiment here for a moment, but it came to mind, because I do think about the Joker discourse this last week and how insufferable that it is. What's disappointing to me about it, and it's the same thing from 2019 when the first film came out as well, is that there isn't much being talked about in terms of let's have an actual conversation about this movie. There's not a whole lot of it. I hated the first film. I'm not giving this film any sort of real thought to it. There's no open-mindedness to it. There's just been a lot of clickbaity, attention grabbing. I don't love this movie. It's terrible. It's trash. Using all of these, catchy phrases to get people to like your post. That's really all I've seen. And it's been drenched in cynicism and nihilism, and it's just exhausting.
Well, it's kind of proving John's point in many ways. Yeah.
Which is. And, and because it, there's a lot of people that, especially if you like the first film, a lot of people aren't liking this film. It's kind of coming from both sides.
Yeah.
But like, it's just interesting how people are willing to overlook what is arguably good things about the film because they want the clickbaity headline.
Yeah.
And that to me, I think is really frustrating, because and again, not to get too into the weeds here, but I find it fascinating. And again, I'm just going to lay I'm just going to lay my cards on the table is what I was trying to say.
Right.
I do not like Joker 2. We'll talk more about it in the review. I'm not the biggest fan of it.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I don't want to come off here as if I am pro Joker 2. I'm a big fan, so let me defend it here for a second. That's not at all what's happening here.
Right.
However, I just find it interesting, ironic that you get this film that is trying to deconstruct the first film, that is commenting on in a lot of ways, it is a movie about the first film.
Mm-hmm.
And it does it in a way that is kind of arguably, I don't know if I fully buy into it, but in a way it is going after those that liked the first film. Or at the very least it's doing, like, it's because it's undercutting what the first film was all about to say it's actually not this at all, which is why people walk away disappointed.
Sure.
I kind of have to admire that boldness, going back to that argument. You know, like,
which is
Todd
fair,
Phillips is making choices that are risky, that clearly have rubbed people the wrong way. At least fans of the first film have walked away disappointed because they feel like the finger's being pointed back at them.
Yeah.
And I say that to say that isn't being talked about. Like, we're not, like, nobody's talking about it in that way, like we do Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi, because it's Todd Phillips. Like, nobody respects Todd Phillips. If it was the same exact film and you replace Todd Phillips with a different name that people like and admire, such as a Rian Johnson, and it's the same exact movie, I think people would look at it and go, oh my God, what an incredible approach to that film. Bravo. And maybe people would even come around to even liking the film more.
It's amazing what beer-covered goggles can do for, I say that as an analogy, but there are a lot of goggles that people wear depending on certain things as opposed to what product they get, just, objectively speaking.
Yeah, and that's why I can't take any of the Joker discourse seriously, like, at all. Like, at all.
It's exhausting.
Again, and regardless of the side of the aisle, like...
Honestly, even that first film, which I don't love and I don't even hate, I went to that movie knowing the discourse that was surrounding it back in 2019. And I came out of that theater thinking, wait, that's it? That's what's getting people riled up? Really?
I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
It's kind of a nothing movie by comparison to other things I've seen.
and I think that's the other irony of it. And we talked about it in our review for the first Joker, and I feel the same way about this one. Like, on its own terms, I just don't feel like the film warrants an extreme reaction either way. It's like, it's fine at best. Like I liked the first Joker, but I wasn't going to go out of my way to be like, this is the best film of the year.
Sure.
I love this movie. But I also didn't care to have the cynicism toward it either. And I feel this, like, I like I just said, I don't love the sequel, but I just don't have the energy to get extremely cynical about it. Yeah. Like, I don't think it's the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's not great either. Like, it's not worth it. Yeah. Like, where the energy comes from, and for me, is not the movie, it's the discourse around the movie. That's what's exhausting.
Yeah, I feel like by that point, you're not even talking about the movie anymore.
No, like, I could, like, without this world that we live in, I could go see that film, Joker, Folie à Deux, walk out of the theater and never think about that film again, and it doesn't impact my life at all. It comes and it goes. That's it. That is the end of the story. But we live in this world where we're online all the time, and what you run into is this exhausting, cynical, just lacking nuanced discourse on social media, and it's migraine inducing. I can't stand it. Like, no one wants to have a real conversation about it. And again, I just love the irony, given the approach of that film, that if it was literally anyone else, if it was any other director besides Todd Phillips, that people would be praising that film for being so subversive, given the success of Joker in 2019. $1 billion, 2 Oscars, all the success that film had, and Joker 2 is essentially going, yeah, none of that really mattered. That's kind of what that film is commenting on. Like, all of that was nonsense. It doesn't really matter. And how can you not? Like, if that was Ryan Johnson, would be sitting here going, can you believe what Ryan Johnson just did? Like, because that, in a lot of ways, that's what that's how people praise The Last Jedi in relation to The Force Awakens.
Well, just as
like
loudly, yeah.
It's the same thing, but people aren't praising Todd Phillips for that.
I say this very facetiously. I don't necessarily believe what I'm about to say or think that this should happen, but it's just meant to prove a point. Very, like I said, facetiously. I am all for the First Amendment. I'm all for freedom of speech. But if they added an addendum to that said freedom of speech, with the exception of talking about movies on social media, I might be for that.
Yeah, except for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I'm asking for is less clickbaity. I want a bunch of likes on this tweet. And let's be honest, you don't have to love the movie. I don't love Joker 2. But I think there's, in an honest conversation, we recognize that what he tried to do with that film was Last Jedi it. That's what he tried to do. Mm-hmm. It wasn't necessarily successful. That I agree with.
Yeah.
But can we not at least acknowledge that he was trying to do that?
Yeah, I guess fair. Not. Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. Yeah, that's that's too diplomatic of a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid.
Yeah.
God forbid.
Yeah,
all right, well, I think with that, we can go ahead and end the show there.
Rant over. Let's talk about something positive next week.
Next week on the show, I promise we'll try to be much more positive.
Maybe we'll do a movie draft of some sort. Maybe we'll do another top 5 list of something. Yeah, we'll think of something that's a bit more celebratory in nature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll have to, because this whole Joker nonsense is exhausting.
I think people may forget about the movie by that point.
Speaking of, we will have a review for Joker Folia 2 coming out later this week. And that'll be the end of it for me. We'll do that review, and then I'm completely moving on from that film forever.
Maybe we can try and make that our shortest review ever.
Might have to.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that. And we're also going to talk about Saoirse Ronan. I've noted this on the show the last few weeks.
Yeah,
I am so excited for Saoirse Ronan to come back in a big way in 2024. She has a new film out called The Outrun. I know it got some limited theatrical releases this last weekend, and we're going to give that one a go as well. We'll review that and Joker, and we'll have a new Chasing the Gold. We'll have a new Women in Session out this week as well, so be on the lookout for all of that. And we have some bonus content from last week. I ended up releasing it kind of late in the week because it was such a busy week, but we have some new bonus content out. If you want to subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/InSessionFilm. If you want to catch us on YouTube memberships, or Apple Podcast subscriptions, however you want to support the show, you can get access to all that bonus content there. And I believe that is it. Am I missing anything, Brendan?
I don't think so. That covers the extent of InSession Film, I think.
Yeah. Of course, be sure to follow us on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. If you have any thoughts about the show, you can email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. If you're watching on YouTube, you can comment below as we do. We got a comment. And look, I will ask for any and all comments. You don't have to agree with anything we say here. We got a comment on our Megalopolis review saying something about how we can't pronounce anything, and that they thought that was very funny. I think that was more of a jab at me than it was to Brendan. Which
was that with regard to Giancarlo Esposito?
I don't know. I have no idea. I'm still waiting to find out because I replied.
That's how he pronounced his own name. So I think I told you about this. There were a few other critics that were getting pushback about pronunciations of that actor's name because everyone thinks his last name is pronounced Esposito, but he pronounces it himself as Esposito.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was very confused by the comment as well. My family is a lot of my family. I'm from Michigan, but a lot of my family is from the South.
Yeah.
And that has absolutely bled into my DNA. So the South isn't known for its articulation.
That's fair. Yeah.
Well, to say it kindly, like they have their own culture where they say things in their own ways, and that's how it's understood. And so, like, when you bleed those Southern roots into my Midwest upbringing, at times, I do think, the words sound weird coming out of my mouth, but I don't know if it's that, or it could be what you're talking about there, Brennan. I don't know. I thought it was an interesting comment, though, so I wanted to bring it here. It's just an example of what I mean. I don't care what the comment is. We'll take it all.
Sometimes it could be genuine feedback, even if it is critical. Sometimes we can utilize that.
We'll take it. We've been called pretentious a lot of times over the years.
Any day of the week. I love that.
We'll take it all. It's fine.
Yeah.
At any rate, with all of that said, be on the lookout for all of that this week. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Oh, the Discourse.
Be nice to people.
No, I don't.